Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Healthy Talk for NFF Youth. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about the experience of young people, both here in our community in London, Elgin, Middlesex, but also across Canada. The experience of young people are so diverse. Youth is a time of exploration, self-discovery and learning and curiosity, and making mistakes and having aha moments. Definitely an exciting and unpredictable time for sure. But enter a global pandemic, and all of a sudden, all of the experienced and knowledgeable adult mentors are also figuring things out as they go, and struggling to navigate a challenging and changing and unpredictable new reality. And this has left young people in an even more challenging position. So we're here today, we're hosting a bit of a panel with three of our youth members from our Neighbors, Friends, and Family Youth Advisory Council. We have Desnour, Ella, and Murado, and we're going to be discussing the experiences of young people from their perspectives throughout the pandemic and their thoughts and ideas on the return to in-person learning and heading back to the classroom. So welcome to our panelists today. Thank you for being here with us. So we're going to jump right into our first question. So just sort of setting the stage for our discussion, but what do you think are some of the most significant or widespread challenges that youth, yourself or your peers have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic? So let's start with Ella.
I think one of the biggest challenges that youth have faced during the pandemic has been social quarantine. During quarantine, we've all been forced into isolation, and as a result, our social skills are a bit blurred. But as restrictions are being lifted, I think that youth suffer from anxiety at the idea of socializing with people outside of their immediate family. I think this is because they have forgotten how to communicate in a group setting and because people have varying degrees of comfort in regards to COVID-19.
Yeah, I think you're definitely hit the nail on the head there, Ella, especially when you think about, the conversations around COVID have been sort of dominating all conversations. And so folks that are more cautious about COVID versus folks that aren't, it's hard to navigate that, and even harder to do that in an in-person setting. So I think that's a really good point. And the anxiety about socializing existed for young people prior to, especially in transitional years. And so going into a new environment, but having not been in it for a while in that learning environment would make it even more difficult. What about you, Murata? What are your thoughts?
So personally, I think it's the isolation that surrounds us. We've watched so many things change around us, like certain relationships, and all of this is completely normal. But this is happening at a quick rate, and being at home can limit and restrict the support needed for youth in times of needing guidance. One significant challenge for me personally has been learning how to cope with life moving on quickly, as it can be quite challenging.
Definitely. I think, and as much as the pandemic has seemed to drag on for most, time has flown by, and every day there's a new restriction or a new change, or, a lockdown is coming into place or being lifted. And so adjusting to things it can be really difficult, and definitely overwhelming. What about you, Desnour?
Since we're in the back to school season, I know a lot of the conversations between my friends and I have been school related, and we have been reflecting a lot on sort of the academic challenges that we had when we were all online because of the pandemic. So a lot of my friends and I all agree that it was just so difficult to find the motivation to do anything, let alone your schoolwork. And specifically doing it to the best of your ability, any sort of achievement oriented mindset we all had kind of went out the window because you're at home, you're in the same four walls every day, and it's just really hard to find that energy to complete your essays or your assignments or anything like that. And on top of that, it was really difficult to reach out to teachers and have that clear and quick communication. Personally, I feel like asking your teacher a question after class ends about the lesson they just taught is much easier than sending them an email, because now you have to wait for that email to come back, and sometimes it never did. So you're left wondering hey, how much is this test actually going to be weighed out of our final mark?
Great, thanks, Desnour, for that. So let's move on to our next sort of discussion question. going back to in-person learning, as much as there's some hesitation and some anxiety, there's also a lot of excitement that I've heard amongst our council and other young people in my life. So what do you think you and your peers are most excited about in terms of returning to class? Let's start with you, Murado.
So I think for me, the at least one thing I'm excited about is the little details that happen during my school day. Like it's never the huge events that make our experience at a school. It is how we I feel like it's how we form our relationships and continue to build upon them with care and trust. Little factors like something like a good morning from a friend or help on a work question from a teacher and socializing at lunch with like your classmates or schoolmates make me very excited to go to school personally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It is those little things that you take for granted that when you haven't had those little interactions for 2 years, you really are excited about those things, the tiny little stories amongst the bigger picture of being in school. What about you, Desnor?
I definitely agree with Murado. I think just being, at least for me personally, I'm going back to school in person. So just being in the building itself and seeing, everyone else working at the school will like automatically just boost my mood. Like, I don't know, 50%, 100%. Insert a random large percentage. Like just being able to see my teachers, get excited about what they're teaching, seeing my friends and having conversations with them, not only about the coursework, but what are you doing this weekend? Do you have a game? Like stuff like that. I think we just really take it for granted. I'm also really excited because our school board has said that we might have sports and like extracurriculars running after school. And that's like something that I really missed out on. I know a lot of like students have missed out on this past year because there's not really much you can do from, your bedroom. So I'm really excited for that. And also, again, just like, hanging out with some friends that I haven't seen in a while because they live a bit further than I do, live away from me and a bit further from the school than I do. Just, being able to like eat with them, like go out for lunch with them. So yeah, just really just seeing people.
Yeah, definitely the theme of those little interactions. What about you, Ella?
I think one of the things youth are most excited about in regards to returning to class is just the in-person teaching and learning style. I found one of the most challenging issues during the pandemic with online classes is just a lack of motivation. Since online classes required a lot of self-guided learning and teaching, it was really hard to stay focused and to stay motivated because there was no one to keep you on track but yourself. So I think youth are excited to once again be taught by teachers and to work alongside students who are learning the same things that they are, because it'll motivate them and keep them on track.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like being in person in a classroom, there's just a little bit of an elevated sense of accountability. When you can see people and you're like, oh, this real person right here is relying on me to get my work done, or my group, or whatever it looks like. I hope that a lot of you feel the same way as you. Awesome. So in terms of sort of switching to the other side of things, there's a lot of excitement, but there's also a lot of anxiety about returning to in-person learning. What do you think young people are most anxious about, most nervous about in terms of returning to class? And let's start with you, Ella, this time.
I think one of the greatest sources of anxiety in regards to returning to class is in-person tests. Over the pandemic, schools used assignments and projects to evaluate students, and that was the main source of assessment. But as students return to in-person classes, tests and exams will once again be the most common form of assessment for students. So I think that students are already putting so much pressure on themselves academically to do well. So adding in that stress to returning to exams and tests, it'll make students even more anxious, as I feel like most students have forgotten how to prepare for those types of assessments.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. There's always been an anxiety around assessment, especially those sort of tests, 3 hours, you have all this specified time to study and prepare. And, when you're out of practice in terms of preparing for that kind of assessment, it can be definitely a big adjustment for young people, for sure. What about you, Desnor?
I definitely agree with Ella. I know that all throughout the past year, like my friends and I would always make these comments like, oh, if this project was a test right now, I would be failing because I'm not understanding anything. Like, and it, like that feeling was just amplified during online learning because there's just so many gaps in your learning and what's being taught to you. Like, it, again, it's so hard to stay motivated. It's so hard to, you know, complete your assigned readings and do all the assigned questions. And I don't know how that's going to translate into an in-person environment when we're expected to be building off of what we learned the previous year. I'm also a bit anxious about that. I'm also just worried in terms of COVID, because I went to school in person for the first little bit last year. I noticed how sort of the restrictions that my school had in place kind of grew more relaxed as time continued, you know, and that social distancing in the hallways wasn't maintained as much as it was in the beginning of the year. So I'm kind of concerned as to how my school will approach it this year and how other schools will too, because obviously if cases start going up again, specifically in your area, chances are they're going to close down schools again. And that's something that I really, really, really don't want.
Right. Like, I think just being consistent, right? Like expecting teachers and educators to be consistent in their messaging to provide safety, but also like the confidence for students to be able to say, like, you're not, like, I'm going to follow the rules, everyone else is going to follow the rules, and then there's not going to be this awkward conversation between me and my peers when we have different comfort levels. So I think that's a really, really good point. Awesome. So in terms of navigating the return to school, what do you think are some skills or activities that youth can practice to reduce anxiety? So taking into consideration the anxieties that you've mentioned, what can young people do to reduce those for themselves or to support their fellow peers in reducing those stressors? Murata, let's start with you.
So, like, everybody has felt some type of anxiety relating to school, and some, of course, more than others. I feel like doing things like that put us more in a routine of life pre-COVID will help us with self-care and take away some anxieties that are relating to school. Like, things that I enjoy and help are sports, clubs, and social groups. Things like these provide support for me and who I am, and I can also meet many people. I can rely on them and like make new friends, of course, and socialize, like, which of course I miss, and that can take away many anxieties that I have relating to school. Like, other things that can help, and like during COVID, of course, people are like, for me, getting ready for a Zoom meeting in the morning means like getting ready for the camera. It doesn't mean getting ready for myself, getting ready doing something that has relating to like going there in real life. So waking up early, making my bed will help, like many things relating to that.
For sure, that routine and sort of getting back into the normalcy of going to a classroom and having a live support network will really help for sure. Ella, what about you?
I think that all youth are going to find this transition both challenging and overwhelming, probably in different ways. But I think that's important that students take a bit of time each day to just do something that they enjoy and something that makes them feel relaxed. I think the strategy will go a long way towards creating a healthy life balance during this transition. I think that another strategy that youth can use is making lists. As we return to in-person classes, I think we're all going to find ourselves a lot busier than we were during the pandemic. So one way to reduce anxiety about being busier is to create lists that you can stay organized and so that you can feel productive as you're crossing things off the list.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip, and something like organization really just keeps your mind at ease, right? So just being able to focus on one thing at a time and breaking big ominous tasks down into more bite-sized steps would really help. I think youth and everybody who's returning to some form of normalcy in their everyday life. What about you, Desnour?
Well, my parents are very big proponents of like taking care of your physical body before even worrying about school. They're like, school is like your second priority. You need to take care of yourself first. So for me, like, or according to them, that includes, getting some exercise, having a healthy diet, and making sure you're getting enough sleep. And I think that's something that we usually overlook because we're like, no, I have to finish this assignment right now. I have to do it perfectly. I need to get like a 95% in this class. And so we're always working ourselves to the bone. So it's really important to take a step back and just be like, no, I need to take care of myself first, because if you yourself aren't at 100%, then you're not going to be able to give your 100% to anything else. I also think it's really good to just have hobbies that like don't serve any productive purpose, but they're only there to make you happy. So for me, that could be like, that's listening to podcasts or like reading fiction, because I know that like this isn't for school, this is just for me. Be it like I'm learning something that I want to learn, or I'm just enjoying like a really good murder mystery. It's just for me. And I was actually talking to my friends about this, or like just what they do so that they feel okay and mentally well during the school year. And one of my friends suggested making a bucket list for the school year of like everything you want to accomplish. And I thought that was so cool, because that way you're going into school, you're not just like, oh, it's another year, like we'll see how it goes. You're going into it with some sense of purpose. And I feel like the bucket list doesn't even have to be like, oh, I need to get like A's in all my classes, but more so like, oh, I'm going to try out for this team, or I'm going to go to this dance, or I'm going to go apple picking with my friends, something like that. Just like some things for you to look forward to that aren't academic or academics related.
Definitely. I think you hit the nail on the head there as well. Like just having things to look forward to and focusing on those exciting things and the positive things that you're going to do instead of focusing on the anxieties is going to really go a long way. And so I like what you said about unproductive. Not that those things are unproductive, because, there's learning to be had, and, reading is always great, but yeah, those things that aren't really tied to any goal or outcome. They're not tied to a grade or anything. They're just sort of what brings you joy for yourself. So I think that will go along. All of these things that you've mentioned, that Ella mentioned, and Rado as well, will go a long way in terms of preventing burnout and making the adjustment easier. That's great. So our last question is with regards to adult supports in the lives of youth. So in your opinion, what are the 3 most important things that educators, teachers, parents, guardians can do to support youth during this transitional time and returning to school? Ella, we'll start with you.
Well, to start, I think one just general thing that they can do is just to be more understanding that we're all having to deal with this transition, and we're all going to transition at different paces. So just be mindful of other people and their transition and their anxiety about going back to in-person life. But 3 specific things that I think adults in our lives can do. One, in respect to teachers and professors, is to provide extensions on assignments and tests for students struggling with the transition back to in-person classes for a number of reasons. One, that some people learned better than others over the pandemic with online learning. So some might be behind and some might be ahead. So just to be mindful of that and to just understand that we're all going back at our own pace. The second thing that I think adults can do is to plan events for students to re-familiarize them with campus and their school and the resources that they offer. Because some students who may be in upper years, it may have been all an online experience. So they haven't yet, even though they're in second year, third year, they haven't been able to spend time on campus. So it's as new to them as the first years. And then the last thing I think they can do is to provide extra mental health resources on campus for students struggling with the transition back to in-person classes, just because I think that this transition is going to be a very emotional one for people, and that they need all the resources they can get just to get back on their feet and back into this new style of life.
For sure, school can be daunting regardless in or out of a pandemic. And so making sure that those supports and that flexibility and understanding is there is really important, especially for, like you said, those young people who are making a dual transition. Not only are they transitioning back to in-person classes, but maybe they're at a school that they have never been to in person before, whether that's going into grade 9 or 10, where they're transitioning and they haven't been in the class, or even, like you said, first year or second year. just being a little bit more mindful of that, I think is really, really good advice. What about you, Desnor? What are your top three?
I think like just agreeing with what Ella said, having teachers create that sort of like positive environment where they're understanding of everyone's unique experiences with COVID, because the pandemic like affected everyone differently. So just understanding that not everyone learned at the same pace, not everyone retained all that material that was taught to them. So expecting those gaps in learning and then adapting accordingly versus just like, you know, assuming that everyone's like already here and we're like ready to go, because obviously that's not going to be the case. Something else that I think would just be really beneficial is just having those check-ins or conversations with students just to see where they are mentally. I know one of my teachers last year, my French teacher, she was really like sweet, like she was really good with this, and she noticed like one week that our like class just wasn't participating as much. Like she's like, you guys seem tired, are you okay? And then at the end of the week she sent us all like an email saying like, I understand, like, you know, it's April, like it's almost the end of the third quadrimester, like you guys just have to keep going, but if there's anything going on, like make sure you reach out to me. And it was just so heartwarming to see, like, you know, at the end of a busy week, like your teacher just emails you that. It's like, wow, like they actually do care about us. I mean, obviously all teachers do, but it's nice to have that like sort of affirmation that like, yes, we are here for you. And then finally, like Ella mentioned, just being flexible with like those deadlines that are given. Again, one of my teachers last year was really good about this, and he like mentioned that straight off, like right when the quadrimester started, that, you know, I understand you guys are juggling coursework with another class, and I understand those other classes may be like super stressful. So if you ever need an extension, just let me know. And like most cases, I'll give you that extension. And he would give us like a longer time period to complete our tasks, like big essays or projects, compared to the other classes, just because he knew that, like, you know, it's June, you know, everyone's kind of mentally checked out. So I'll give you guys as much time as you need. And that was just, again, really helpful.
Seems like that flexibility of expectations is really important, just to sort of meet students where they're at, and each student where they're at, and just doing those personal check-ins seems to go a long way. I think it's a relationship that you have with your teacher, just like with your peers or your parents. And so having them reach out in that personal way and say, I'm here for you. How can I help? How can I make learning enjoyable again? How can I support you? I think, yeah, that sounds like you had a good group of teachers last year. Murata, what about you? What are your tips for the adults in your life?
So like many educators and adults are unfamiliar how to navigate a pandemic lockdown, as they should be. Like the last pandemic we had was like 100 years ago, and I'm not sure, like there's no handbook how to deal with a pandemic, of course. They can lack empathy when it comes to stress from youth relating to the school transition in the coming weeks. And like where Dasnur said, building bridges and reaching out can go a long way when it comes to that. Acknowledging that many of us may be a little stressed is one thing that's important, and like reaching out is one way to solve that. Like for example, the last full year I had in school was in grade 6, which feels like so long ago, but it feels like yesterday as well. And I'm now going to high school, which is like, that was a huge gap in my in-person education. So, and one other way they can help bridge those gaps are to, of course, reach out, like Dasner said. Like, I totally agree with that. And an email, like I had this one teacher in grade 8, she was very kind with extensions, and she would always mention how she knows what we're feeling. She would give us like, I feel like I received a lot of empathy from her, and with all of her academic expectations. One other one, and this is kind of more outside of school, but this can relate to adults as well, is to not bring up COVID-19 in every situation. Like that does not mean we should stop talking about it or we should stop giving awareness to it, but it's just that like sometimes the word pandemic has so much power with our youth, and they can feel so much stress. Like personally, when I think of the word pandemic, I think of, online school, how stressful it is. how I'm growing up while in lockdown and sometimes feels like the world's going at such a rapid pace.
Almost like things are moving past you and you're not really being able to be part of it. I think that sentiment is pretty common in a lot of people. I think those are really, really good points. And I think you're right too. The word pandemic, COVID-19, it does have a lot of power and it tends to dominate a lot of conversation. And so being mindful of that and trying to talk about other things that bring hope and joy and, motivation back to each other's lives is going to be really important. That's really great. Thank you. I think some of our adult viewers will find that really helpful in how they navigate their relationships with the young people in their lives. So just to close off, do you have any final pieces of advice? Like, what is the piece of advice you're telling yourself right now in preparing to go back to school? And I'll leave it open. Does anyone want to jump in? What are you telling yourself right now?
I think I'm telling myself to just not be too hard on myself, that this isn't like normal years. It's not just another grade that you're going into or another year. It's a transition. And so to be kinder to yourself if you're not performing the way you want to. But that's my goal for this year.
That's a really, really good one. I think everyone can take a page out of your book in that and just be kind to yourself and to others too. Anyone else want to jump in?
My goal is very similar to Ella's, just taking it easy because school isn't the end all be all. This is my senior year of high school, so I already feel like the pressure to have and maintain a high average and then apply to universities and, be a good role model for like the freshmen and sophomores. So as someone who gets really like anxious over the smallest things, I think like it's really important that I just let myself know it's not that deep and it's okay to not be at my 100% all the time. The school year is not going to be any easier if I carry around all these internal expectations of how I should and should not be doing, because I'm inevitably going to fall short on them. And then that's just going to impact like my mental health and how I view myself in a negative manner. So my parents have actually been really good with like encouraging that mindset and telling me to do like typical teenage things, like going out to eat with my friends, like in a COVID friendly manner, of course, or like getting my D2 or getting a job at my dojo, like just really encouraging me to like get out of the house or just like out of that school mindset. So it's really helpful to have a support system that's encouraging you to do the same.
Definitely. I think, and I like what you said about this is a transition back to school, but it's also a transition back to youth. It's a transition back to life, right? So those things like your sports and your activities and your meeting up with friends, like those are part of the experience. And so making sure you make time for that transition too. Yeah, for sure. What about you, Murado?
Like, I totally agree with what she said. Unlike her, though, I am actually heading into high school, right into grade 9. I actually had my orientation yesterday. And while walking through those halls, it seemed daunting. The hall, like, I felt like I got lost if it wasn't for my tour guide, who was a senior. And they seemed like they were very chill about school. Like, they were like okay with coming back. Sometimes it feels like I'm the only one experiencing the pandemic. And like the advice I'm telling myself is that no, everybody's experiencing this, everybody's going through this, everybody has anxiety going back, transitioning back into school. So yeah, it's comforting saying that to myself.
Definitely seeing yourself and your experiences and others is definitely a comforting thing. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to remind yourself of constantly. And so just to recap for everyone watching, when we're all heading back into school next week and back into some semblance of not post-pandemic, but I guess the recovery stage, be kind to yourself, take it easy. Like school isn't the end all be all. Focus on it, but also focus on life. And remember, like Murado said, that everyone is going through this in some capacity. So you're not alone in this. There is resources, there are supports. And we'll be sharing those supports with you in the chat. And thank you so much to our panelists today, Ella, Murado, and Desnour. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.